Matthew, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Very pleased to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Absolutely. So for those that don't know, you taught one of my favorite classes when I was at Wharton, and it was a class on managing careers. And so I thought for today's episode, we could dig in and talk about careers broadly, more generally, data that you might be seeing, research that you've done, and so forth. But I'd like to start to ask you about you and your own career. Tell me how you got started in doing this type of research and what led you to where you are today.
Yeah, so to give you the longish version, so I started off in consulting. I spent a couple of years working as a consultant. My standard joke about it is to say that I learned that working is hard and maybe studying other people working might be easier. The slightly truer version, working was hard. I kind of felt if I'm going to be working 60 hours a week, I'd better be doing something I find interesting. And I had a strong sense that the people I looked at and said, yeah, I'd like to do that, tended to be the people who were kind of really experts in the firm, as opposed to kind of, your generalist of, sure, I'll go build an Excel model and a PowerPoint, but I don't really know anything about this kind of person. So that pushed me towards doing a PhD. And I think I was, in my previous studies, I got very interested in the idea of kind of employment as this link between our lives and what goes on in the economy. And so understanding how that was changing was something that I was really interested in. And careers to me became kind of a thread for understanding a lot of that. Slightly challengingly for somebody who's at a business school, I don't really care about company profitability. Companies can, by and large, take care of themselves. I think I tend to be more interested in what employment means for people's lives. And, careers are, in a sense, how our lives unfold through work. And so that just always, for me, was a kind of a touchstone of what does this mean for people? And I think it is probably I'm somebody who the opposite of mindful, right? Always curious about where's this going to get me? Not am I enjoying it today, but where's it going to get me? Kind of, I think a lot of people who are in the MBA are like this, always striving after the next thing. And so thinking about careers thinking about work in terms of where it's getting me, I think is a natural piece for that.
Yeah.
In terms of careers.
One way to understand careers would also to be maybe define it by what it's not, to foil it against other things. So we could imagine that there's jobs, which might just be, hey, I show up to work, I get a paycheck. Careers, which as you mentioned are, something about how life unfolds with work. And then maybe there's something above that, right? Like a calling, right? Which we might not define as a career, but as something even, I would say above that, but feels that way. When you do research in careers, do you think at all about like a stratification of types of work like that?
Certainly people have. That I think is the, there's that idea of the psychological orientation. I know when I've polled my MBAs, about 30% see themselves as having a calling. The vast majority see work as a career of kind of, it's an attempt to move up in the world. I do think everybody has a career in some sense. That balance between what am I getting out of it today versus seeing it as kind of, a way to get to where I want in the future definitely varies. But I still think, for everybody, there's an important component of what am I getting now? And where might this take me? And so we're going to be working a long time, most of us.
Yeah.
And so I think that interest in just where is this leading? I think it is there for everybody.
Yeah. You've been researching careers then for quite a while. I'd be curious to know if there's anything that has been really surprising to you or perhaps paradoxical in your research that you've uncovered or discovered so far.
I think kind of a central thing that I found interesting is how wrong a lot of the current narratives about careers are. So I think what we've been hearing really for the last 20 years is the organization is dead. We're all free agents. Modern careers are about hopping around and finding the best deal. And all of my research in various different ways kind of going, yeah, that's kind of wrong. That actually successful people often build satisfying careers largely by spending long chunks of time in one organization or another. That's not to say there aren't a bunch of people who've done very well by job hopping.
Yeah.
But I think this kind of the organizational career is dead story, which is so prevalent, it just doesn't stack up with any of the data.
Interesting.
So that's been kind of my big aha from all of this.
That's fascinating. I'd love to double click on that for 1 second. I hear a lot of that narrative about we're all kind of free agents and what have you, and it resonates with me. And I'm wondering if it resonates with me because maybe it's a generational shift, and maybe some of the data that these studies have been a part of are for older workers, and a younger worker like myself. We haven't seen the fruits bear out of the hopping. Or maybe there's also industry focus, right? I work in tech where job hopping is, if people are at a workplace for 4+ years, they're like a total veteran. Is there any nuance behind, maybe job hopping does work in certain situations, or does your research find, no, generally speaking, longer careers in single places are better?
So one analogy I've come up with is limpets. You know what limpets are?
I don't.
You don't. So if you go to the beach, like along rocks, you'll see a lot of these little conical shells that are just stuck to the rocks. They're called limpets, like
Okay.
little sea animals. So it turns out if you study the life cycle of the limpet, which I haven't, but it's on Wikipedia. So with these limpets, they release their larvae into the sea, and the larvae will swim around for a long time until one day they've reached a certain stage where they're kind of fully grown, and then they will go and find a rock and stick on it. And once they're stuck on that rock, that's pretty much it. They'll eat stuff that comes their way, but they're kind of fine home. A lot of careers look a little bit like that, which is we go through our larval phase of wandering around and trying out lots of things and finding the best rock. But a lot of people sooner or later find that rock. And so if you're in your 20s, on average, the average length of time people are in organizations in their 20s is 2 to 3 years. If you look at people in their 40s and 50s, it's about 8 years. That's not a generational thing. So you've seen that pattern through the decades, which is young people learning about ourselves, learning about where we fit, all of those sorts of things. We tend to move around and search the best thing. But usually we reach a stage in our careers where we find something and we just stick there. I've been playing around recently. Somebody gave me a data set of the careers of the top 10 executives in the largest 100 firms. Yeah, and one of the things that I find interesting is you see huge variation, right? So there are some firms where most of the top managers have been there for quite a while, and some surprising ones like Microsoft.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at the top management team of Microsoft, it's not just Satya Nadella, right, who's been there since he was about 26.
Right.
It's, there are 2 or 3 other people in the top 10 who have spent their entire career at Microsoft. And so I think when we talk about tech versus non-tech, I think there are even maybe a couple of people at Alphabet who've been there an awfully long time. When we talk about tech versus non-tech, it's a bit more complicated than that. There certainly is this kind of Silicon Valley ideal. But you see, even with the tech industry, there are a surprising number of people who stick for quite a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. This is great because one of my favorite sessions of your class focused on career transitions. And so for a lot of folks in my audience, I know they're thinking about career transitions, whether it's voluntary or involuntary or parental leave or what have you. Talking about, say, Satya Nadella joining Microsoft when he's 26, I'm sure that when he was 26, he didn't have a plan to become Microsoft CEO. I mean, maybe he did. But I'd like to dig in with you about career planning. Is that a fallacy? Is that something that you shouldn't plan for? Or if you can plan for it, what does a good plan look like?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, so as part of the course that I do, there's a project at the end, which you might remember. I send people out to kind of interview 5 people about their careers, kind of people who are older, and ask how it goes. And one of the central things that everybody comes back with is they hear, you can't have a plan, trying to plan this is pointless, there's so much serendipity, you have no idea how things are going to pan out. So, the idea that you start with a plan and execute it doesn't seem to stack up with reality. I'm sure that's right. nobody can foresee all the twists and turns that their career is going to take. On the other hand, I think it is helpful to have some sense of where you might like to go. Because every decision that you make has implications, be that when I'm thinking about choosing between jobs. Different jobs are going to make it easier versus harder to follow certain career paths.
Yeah.
And so I want to be thinking about what comes next. And even as I think about inside an organization or, even within the same job, which projects I'm taking, different projects build different skills, signal different abilities, give me the opportunity to meet different people. And so again, I probably want to have some sense of what direction I hope to move in order to make good decisions there. My favorite quote on this, so Eisenhower, American general, had some great line about, I find that in battle, plans are useless, but in preparation for battle, planning is essential. And so this idea that, nothing's going to play out as you expect it to, but unless you have some sense of what might happen and where you might want to go, you're not going to make the best of things.
I love that. And I've spent most of my career in some sort of planning capacity in technology. So oftentimes what this looks like is an Excel model that tries to predict sales, tries to predict costs, tries to predict profit. And so for me, a plan is basically, it looks like an Excel model or like an Excel sheet, has a lot of assumptions, and I'm clear about my assumptions. I'm curious for a career plan. What does that look like? Is that, hey, I enjoy these activities. Hey, I think I'm really strong at these skills and I need to demonstrate them. Is there any part of your research that looks into what a good plan looks like?
I haven't looked exactly at that. I mean, I think the two things that I would want to be thinking about are, what do I think are some of the jobs it would be fun to be doing? If I look 10 years out, maybe 15. I mean, if I look to, most of us start to plateau late 30s, early 40s, right? So we're kind of, beyond that, there might be some more moves, but there's probably a nice point at which to say, by that stage, I will be a successful VC partner. I will be in the senior management of a startup, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or, I will be an executive in a tech firm. So we have some sense, and there I might continue to go up, I might plateau, but at least that's my destination. I think it's useful to have a few ideas of what that might be. I think to be absolutely fixated on, I have to be CEO, I have to be a partner in this consulting firm, that's too narrow.
Yeah.
But, I have 2 or 3 ideas of, I think these all seem like fun directions that I could go in.
Yeah.
And to have at least some sense of, if I wanted to do that, these are some of the things that might prepare me for it. These are some of the things that might not. So as I think about planning, that's the sort of thing I'm thinking of.
One of the things that I hear a lot of like career coaches talk about that's kind of in line with what you're saying is sometimes people say, look at what you did or what you enjoyed as a child, or, find your ikigai. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of ikigai. It seems like it's a buzzword du jour. It's a Japanese term that's basically an overlapping of passions, how you can make money, and something you enjoy doing. I'm curious if there's any, tips you would have for folks trying to find what it is that those different options might be for themselves. Is it as simple as a brainstorming exercise? Should they look back at what they've done in their childhood? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm a bit nervous about saying look at your childhood, because you've probably changed a lot since then. The world has changed a lot since then. There are only so many people who are going to make it as a professional baseball player or whatever it is. So there's a big... But I think there are multiple exercises. I mean, I think quite a good book on this is What Color is Your Parachute? But, I've read a bunch of these career guides, and they all have some exercise of sit down and write down what do you really enjoy and what's meaningful to you. Sit down and write down what do you think are your kind of big strengths. I'm sure it's useful to know those. I'm sure some of us are more self-aware than others. in terms of really understanding what our strengths are. One of the big things that shapes my view of careers, I guess I'm a pessimist, or at least I think I'm pessimistic about our ability to make really good predictions about what will make us happy. And so I think it's often hard to know if we're going to enjoy something until we've tried it. And I think it's often really hard to know what a job will actually entail until we spent some time doing it.
Yeah.
So I think there's a huge amount of trial and error that goes on as well.
Yeah. Trial and error as discovering things seems like it's probably just better off in introspection for these, right? You can sort of hypothesize in your head whether or not you'd like a job, but it's an entirely different thing to actually be in that job.
It's a mixture, and I think the word hypothesize is a good one, right?
Yeah.
Which is we're generating hypotheses, we're not generating answers.
You made mention of the Eisenhower quote. I'll give you a Mike Tyson quote, which is that everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And I'd be curious if for those folks, just because I know my audience skews rather largely tech, sometimes we're sort of taken out of our career unexpectedly, whether via layoff, business reduction, could be family reasons, what have you. Can you talk about some things to expect if we have a sudden change in our employment and maybe techniques to either stay sharp with our skills or get back in the workforce or just to get back on the right track?
That's a great question. Yeah, layoffs happen. We surveyed our MBA alums 12 years ago, maybe more. God, I'm getting old. But one of the questions we asked have you ever been laid off? I think people have been out of the workforce 15 or 20 years. About a third of them have been laid off. Layoffs have actually become, on a workforce wide level, they've actually become less common since then. It's weird. Like, I know in tech, it's like, wow, layoffs are everywhere. If you look at the national statistics, layoffs are nowhere, but they're kind of really hitting certain segments. So yeah, it would be interesting to know if we did it again today, what the impact would be. It's not much fun. One of the things I do when I teach the class, I often ask people, do you think layoffs are good for careers or bad for careers?
Yeah.
There is a substantial minority of the class who think they might be quite good for careers.
Really?
And their logic, which is a sensible one, is we can easily get complacent where we are. And so we can get stuck in a job that isn't necessarily the right thing for us. And sometimes a layoff will kick us out of that and force us to reappraise and go do what we actually should be doing. And you will find a bunch of people who will say, I got laid off and it was the best thing that happened to me. I don't think they're the majority, right? Sadly, there are also a bunch of people who get laid off and they were doing their dream job and now they can't do it anymore. And so it's a mix. I think one of the big challenges with layoffs is they're a confluence of two things. So it's the business is not doing well and they're looking to cut. People don't think the cuts are random. And so I think a particular challenge with them is, what are people taking away? So to what extent do people see that layoff and wonder what it says about the person being laid off?
Yeah.
And the answer is most of the time, nothing. Like, most of the time you were in the wrong place at the wrong time and they decided to shut that particular area. But people aren't quite sure. When we looked at our MBA alums, we did find there was you could see it showing up in how much people were being paid, the effect of a layoff. Interestingly, kind of when we compared people who'd been laid off versus those who moved voluntarily, we didn't see particularly big changes in the job that they went to next. Like, we didn't see often very big changes in where their title increased, how many people reported to them. We did see big changes in they were less likely to get paid well. I think part of the challenge of being laid off is you lose your bargaining power. So everybody has their stories about when you move companies, you get a big pay raise, and often you do.
Yeah.
But a big part of the reason for that is the employer really needs you, and you've already got a great alternative.
Yeah.
So they kind of have to start throwing money at you
Yeah.
in order to get you to come join. If you've been laid off, they don't need to throw money at you in the same way. So I
Right.
think there are definitely kind of bargaining power effects.
That's a fascinating observation. To continue with the bargaining power sort of concept, of course, if you're talking to an employer, they may or may not know your own work status, whether you have multiple offers. Oftentimes, when people are looking for work, they're probably talking to multiple people. Is there a way to maintain that bargaining power even if you are unemployed, or is that something that in your data we're just not seeing that draw out?
It's hard to tell. I mean, again, one of the great things about data, it's always an average. Right. I mean, it was interesting to see there were some people who got laid off and their next job was way better than the one they got laid off from. It was less likely than people who'd moved voluntarily.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I showed to terrify my MBAs is there's a study of people who got laid off in Pennsylvania in the 1980s, which is unutterably depressing. Like, I think for people over 40, 5 years after being laid off, they were still earning 25% less than they would have been. Their life expectancy fell by a year. I mean, all these terrible things. And, that's a worst case scenario. And the big expectation, or the strong hypothesis there, is it was so bad because they were coming out of dying industries, right? So your steel mill shut down in Pennsylvania in the mid-1980s. You're not going to be able to reuse those skills. You're not going to be in demand. And so, I think when you look at how this varies, if you're laid off from a booming industry, that's not going to be a bad thing, right? I mean, if you're working in an AI startup, and for whatever reason it goes under, there are going to be a lot of people competing for your
skills.
Business.
Yeah.
If it's an industry in free fall, I think, for example, AI has been toughest. A lot of the ed tech companies are really trying to think about what it means for their model. If there's not a lot of money going in there, it's more difficult. I mean, the unhelpful advice once you've been laid off is it's useful to have a big cushion, right? I mean, so part of your bargaining power is how desperate you are. If you feel I need another job in a couple of months to make rent, then you're not going to be as prepared to play hardball as somebody who feels, I've got 9 months or a year, I can line up a bunch of employers and I'm only going to go for the right opportunity. So I think that certainly helps.
Yeah. I'd be curious, you made mention about, some quotes, people getting laid off, the best thing that ever happened to me because they were maybe complacent. Forget the layoff part. How do we recognize when we are maybe complacent in the workforce? There might be some people who, they've been doing the same job for 5 years. In some ways, they might feel super complacent. In other ways, boy, it's a really good thing. I have good work-life balance. Are there signs that we should be aware of in terms of, hey, I'm employed right now, but I'm thinking about moving on. Is this the right move for me?
It's a great question. There's nothing wrong with being complacent, right?
Right.
I mean, one of the things that I've got kind of interested in a peripheral way is the research on happiness. And across a lot of dimensions, money has a surprisingly small impact on it. So if I am enjoying going into work every day, maybe I could be progressing faster somewhere else and maximizing my net worth. But if I'm enjoying going into work every day, that's a pretty good thing. Warning signs for me, I think, just not being happy. Right? If I am not enjoying what I am doing, that's a big one. Yeah, if I see my peers kind of from school or wherever seem to be moving ahead and I'm not. And particularly if I feel that I'm not because there just aren't those opportunities in my organization. Again, that's where I have to trade those two things off. Maybe I kind of say, but I like it here and I'm willing to take that. But I think that's where I would start to think, how much is that worth to me? One thing you do hear a lot when you talk to employers, somebody has been in the same job for a long time, that starts to raise red flags. I mean, a little bit same organization. So there's some evidence that, once you've been in the same organization for more than about 10 years, employers are starting to worry about, could you adapt to somewhere new? That is much worse if you've also been in the same job. And so if you've been in the same job for a few years without really changing, people are starting to wonder, how adaptable are you? Yeah. And so that's also, I might like this job, so I might want to stay in it, but I might start worrying as well, if something does happen, is this going to make it harder to make the next step?
Yeah. I'd be curious if there are ways to sort of mitigate that risk. So like one of the ones that I've thought about is, of course, you have internal networking in your own firm, but then of course there's external networking with people who might be in your role outside of your own firm, right? So if you run a trading desk for, foreign currency or something at JP Morgan, why not get to know the Morgan Stanley guys or what have you, right? Are there ways beyond what I just mentioned to sort of mitigate that risk if you've been at the same firm for a long time?
Yeah. I think you're right. You want to build that external reputation. You want to have those networks. Sometimes easier to do through our job, sometimes harder. But, going to conferences, joining industry associations, all of those sorts of things, a way to do that. I think you want to stay learning. I do think, one of the other things we see, breadth is good, right? Particularly
what's good?
Breadth.
Breadth, yeah.
Being broad, having a variety of skill sets, having a variety of experiences and interests. And it partly protects you. Like I say, you don't want to be that steel worker.
Right.
Used to be great to be a steel worker. When it stopped being good to be a steel worker, it was really bad. If your industry takes a nosedive, do you have enough breadth that it's easy to go do something else? And so I think, if you like standard advice I give, if you like your organization, stay there.
Yeah.
What you're doing, stay at that firm. Move jobs. Go take on new challenges, take on new projects. I think that is important to maintaining that kind of hireability.
Yeah. You made mention of those workers in Pennsylvania in the 1980s, and this sort of starts a lot of geographic questions in my head. And I know that some of your research has to do with, should you take that job abroad? Or what, like, should you move for a job? Does that maximize earnings and what have you? I'd be curious if you have thoughts on, hey, if you're living in a certain place and you get, let's say, a lateral or slight up in terms of a job in a different place, different city, perhaps different country, what does your research show about moving for a job?
We did look at this in terms of moving across countries. It's quite complicated. On the one hand, high flyers are more likely to move. And so people already earning well are more likely to move across countries. I think probably to some extent, companies are more likely to invest in moving around people who are doing well. Once you take that into account, if anything, it seems that making one or two international moves actually seem to hurt people's earning power. There's some qualitative research on this. I think the challenge is, we kind of think, wow, now I have international experience, but it's like, no, now you spent some time in France. And actually what you learned in France and the networks you built are just not actually going to be terribly useful when you come back to the US. So compared to the person who's in Des Moines, Iowa, less sexy, but actually what they've been doing is in some ways more relevant to us. So I think that, we found people have moved a lot. There's potentially some value, but I think the international moves from a financial perspective didn't appear to pay off as much as we would think. Now, I've worked in 3 continents and I've loved that. I think there is I think that mobility thing I would probably think about more from a lens of your personal life.
Yeah.
So it is, I think, there's a lot of reasons to stay where you are, kind of your entire social life, your social circle, if you're embedded in your community, if you have a family. That's, the tremendous cost of uprooting all that. There's a huge amount of personal growth from moving as well, particularly to somewhere more different. I find it very stimulating. And so It's
Yeah.
finding the right balance there I would find more important than kind of the career questions.
A lot of folks, this is great. A lot of folks also, I know, moved, I don't want to say abroad, but just elsewhere for personal reasons, as you may mention in the pandemic, right? I was in New York City. So many of my friends left New York City. Some of them had kids. They wanted to move to the suburbs. Some of them were thought, hey, I love skiing. I just want to move to Boulder. And if I can keep
Yeah.
my job and do this and be remote, this is a huge upgrade in terms of my personal life. Now that we've had 4 years under our belt of remote work, I'm curious if you know what happens to remote workers, if we see any difference between their career and folks that have either a hybrid or in-person work model.
There's not a lot of high quality research on this yet, and we're hoping to do some studies. Pre-pandemic, I think there was fairly strong evidence that people who were remote got slower promotions. And we're starting to see some early, not terribly rigorous studies post-pandemic showing the same thing. I would place a strong bet on that. I think there are huge amounts of benefits to remote work. I think the thing that the pandemic really taught us is there are tremendous costs to bringing people together to the same place.
Sure.
Sometimes those are worthwhile, sometimes there aren't, and just believing we automatically need to do it all the time doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think if I'm ambitious about my career, we know networks are important, and we know being co-located is a great way to build those networks. And so I think it is, if you do want to be in Boulder and ski all the time, that's great, but you want to accept that a cost of that is likely to be you are not going to be advancing as fast in your career as somebody who stays in New York, is in the office 3 to 5 days a week.
Yeah. The other major shift that we've had in the workplace, I'd say, and this is maybe more recent, not just COVID being 4 years ago, but is AI. How are we seeing jobs and careers being impacted by AI, or is it still also too early to tell?
Too early. My strong opinion on this is anyone who tells you with deep conviction how AI is going to change jobs is fooling themselves and trying to fool you. I think the way that technology has played out in the past has been so complex. The example I always think about is journalists. Like, the journalism industry was devastated by the internet. And you would expect the internet, if anything, should make journalism, should help journalists. What really happened was all of the newspapers were funded by classified ads. They all moved to Craigslist, and local newspapers died. So I think it's just really hard to know. And you saw kind of when ChatGPT came out, there were all these people like, within 6 months, all of these jobs will be dead. Surprise, surprise, nothing happened. I'm starting to get into the mildly surprised that I'm not seeing kind of major products. We're still 18 months later, still in this something cool could be coming phase, as opposed to products that are out there. So huge upheaval. In the past, you've always had this balance between you take away some tasks and you end up adding others. It will probably be similar.
Great. Well, I thought we could also transition. I got some fan mail questions for you, if you don't mind me asking. First question, what is something that you've changed your mind about with respect to careers?
I've changed my mind about how careers have changed. I think I mentioned at the beginning, I really came into this field because of a strong sense that careers were very different than they used to be, and we needed to understand how they work now. I've modified that a bit. So I think careers did change a fair bit between about 1975 and 1995. But since 1995, they've been surprisingly stable. And so I think, I was definitely all on board this kind of, we're all going to be free agents bus. And I'm now off that bus.
Interesting.
Right? I think it's like, 25 years we've been predicting it and it didn't happen. At a certain point, we probably need to turn around and say, maybe we're missing something. So that, I think, has been, that's a place where I've changed my mind.
Another letter. This is from Byron in Boston. A piece of advice I keep getting when choosing jobs or organizations is to prioritize choosing your general, which is to say a mentor or strong leader who you really trust, admire, and can champion you. What should I look for in choosing a general?
That's a great question. And I think it's a good piece of advice. If we, again, I often come back to what actually makes people happy in jobs, and trusting relationships with their managers is way high.
Mm.
The nicest piece of advice I heard about this actually was about choosing a company rather than choosing a manager, which is go talk to some people who've left. Like everybody who's there now will give you the party line about how marvelous it is. I think partly because they feel some pressure to hire, partly also because everybody's trying to justify their own decisions. Saying this is a terrible place to work, but I'm still here because I'm a loser. Nobody wants to say that. So it's got to be a fantastic place to work. But the people who've left, I think they feel less of that pressure. And so they're probably going to give you the positives and the negatives. Similarly, I think people who've worked with that manager. Something that worries me, in an interview, you're going to learn whether somebody's charismatic. I don't know what the correlation is between charisma and being a great mentor, but I doubt it's very high. I think there are a lot of other, there's kind of long-term, can I trust that person? Do they really care about their subordinates? Do they invest in people? Those sorts of things. So you want to see where are the group of people who would kind of, walk through fire for that person. If you find those people, that's probably a good bet. Whereas if people work for them for a couple of years and then get out as fast as possible, then I want to be careful.
Yeah, great advice. I love that. Another common thing coming up with my friends, and this is from another mailbag question. How do you think about leaning in and out at different points in your career after parental leaves? How would you advise someone thinking about making a major career pivot after leave in search of a better day-to-day balance? So for instance, if they're coming from consulting or investment banking, how would you guide them in thinking about that pivot out of something that's so intense?
Another great question. I think, unfortunately, in the kind of roles I think a lot of the people you're speaking to are in, there are real trade-offs, right? I think we all believe that we should live in a world where we can be tremendously professionally successful and have a very rewarding family life. Definitely some people manage it, but I think a lot of the people who are most professionally successful do so by working incredible amounts and are in jobs where that is highly rewarded. A big part of it, I think, is just knowing what is important for you, and how you feel about those trade-offs. So it's slightly your research now. There was research done in 2010 looking at Chicago alums. One of the things that they found that was kind of depressing was people who had taken time out of the workforce for more than 6 months. It was kind of a persistent and substantial earnings penalty.
Interesting.
It's one thing to downshift a bit, and I think that makes a lot of sense. There are a bunch of people who will decide I want to quit work, stay home with my kids. That's great. But I think the thing I always want people to recognize about that is it's a long-term decision. But I think for most people, having done that, the sad truth is, historically, it has both meant that kind of your skills and your network start to erode a little bit, which kind of reduces your value. It can also signal to employers that you want balance in your life. And for certain jobs, employers prefer people who don't want balance in their life. Now, some people tell me that's changed, and I really hope it has changed.
Yeah.
But I've always felt like historically kind of the advice has been, if that's what you want to do, you should absolutely do it. But you should do it knowing you're taking a long-term decision. That it's not, I'm going to hop out of the workforce for 3 years and then leap straight back in where I was before. That has historically been quite a hard trick to pull off.
Interesting.
But instead it's moving you towards a slightly different trajectory. And again, for a lot of people, that's the right thing, but just understand the implications of your decision.
Right. This has been fantastic. I feel so lucky to have had the chance to take your class. But the last question that I have for you, because I know that so many of my peers from Wharton have asked me to ask you, if they didn't get the chance to take your class, what are some suggested readings that you might be able to provide? I know you mentioned What Color Is Your Parachute. What other things should people read to help them think through their own career?
That's great. Yeah. So What Color Is Your Parachute, I think, is actually a really great book for kind of finding jobs. I think Michael Watkins has a book called Your Next Move, which I found really interesting for thinking about as you move jobs, what are the things you need to bear in mind. There's a book by a woman called Aminia Ibarra, which is called Working Identity, which talks a lot about people trying to make big career transitions and the issues that they're making. I'm now at work on my own book on careers, which I hope will hit the bookshelves sometime in 2026.
Bestseller.
Definitely buy that book when it comes out.
I love it. Well, Professor Bidwell, thank you so much for your time today. Would love to have you back on in the future. And I deeply appreciate you talking to me about careers.
No problem. Great to speak with you.
Take care.
Thanks for having me on.